is a real honor for me, and it brings back, this presentation goes back to my first visit to the Institute 30 years ago, when as a freshly minted PhD, I, with great fear and trembling, came up the steps and was introduced to the riches of the Bulling of Briefwechsel by Rainer Hemrich and his colleagues at the time, Kurt Jacobucci and Hans-Ulrich Bechtold. And this is, in a very small way, my thanks for their introduction to the wealth of this correspondence. Contemporary Western culture is dominated by social media, which play a vital role in the transmission of news, the spread of rumors, the shaping of public opinion, and both the creation and destruction of reputation. One need only think of the role of Facebook in the spread of the Arab Spring, or of President Trump's use of tweets to mobilize his supporters and antagonize his opponents, of which I am one of the latter, to realize the power that social media exercise in the 21st century, linking individuals and creating networks across wide distances. The early modern equivalent of modern social media was the letter. Although letters did not move with the rapidity allowed by digital technology, they performed the same function in the dissemination of news, information, rumor, and gossip. In a world where the learned elite was thinly scattered throughout Europe, letters allowed like-minded individuals to remain in contact with each other. It has also become common to refer to this network of intellectuals, especially in the later 17th and 18th centuries, as the Republic of Letters, a phrase that relies on the dual meaning of litera, or letters, as both literary studies and the means by which those studies were disseminated. In recent years, scholars have begun to examine correspondence networks more closely with the aid of digital technology. There are currently projects devoted to the correspondence of German physicians, Dutch scientists, French philosophers, and women throughout Europe, to name just a few. A project based in Heidelberg is collecting and editing the largely unpublished letters of theologians from the southwest corner of the Holy Roman Empire, active between 1550 and 1620. Significantly, the Heidelberg project excludes the correspondence of the first generation of reformers, which has long been available to scholars. Print editions or summaries of the correspondence of several Swiss and South German reformers, including Huldrych Zwingli, Johannes Ecolampadius, Joachim Vadian, and Ambrosius Blarer, were published in the early 20th century. The correspondence of other major figures, such as Wolfgang Capito, Martin Bucer, and Heinrich Bullinger, is still being edited today. Historians have relied on these editions to trace the progress of the Reformation in Switzerland and South Germany. Zwingli's correspondence, for instance, has been used to illustrate his development as a reformer, his early contacts with Ecolampadius, his connections with Bern, and his growing influence throughout the Swiss Confederation, to name just a few studies. And the image is from Benedict's Christ Church's The Early Reformed. This concentration on the correspondence of individual reformers is both necessary and important. It is not, however, sufficient to explain how local reform movements intersected and coordinated as they developed institutional churches. For that, we must look at the networks that joined correspondence in several different places, and not just at the individual reformers who were nodes in the network. Tracing the evolution of the Swiss South German network over the course of the 1520s gives us a more nuanced view of the consolidation of the Zurich Reformation. Most of the reformers who belonged to this network were strongly influenced by Erasmus, and so it is easy to assume that they all belonged to a vaguely defined humanist network that spanned the region in the second decade of the 16th century, and that broke apart due to the religious disagreements of the early 1520s. This view is too simple, however. In fact, on the eve of the Reformation, the men who would become the leading reformers of South Germany and Switzerland belonged to three distinct, although overlapping, three distinct but overlapping correspondence networks. These networks aligned with the three possible career paths for young humanists: the church, the school, or the printing house. It took almost a decade for the men involved in reform movements throughout South Germany and Switzerland to coalesce into one network characterized by their common religious commitment. As might be expected, the two most important catalysts for the development of this network were the outbreak of the Eucharistic controversy at the end of 1524 and the Bern Disputation held in early 1528. Despite the growth of this united network, though, significant differences continue to exist between the German and the Swiss sides of this network, and these differences would prove important for developments after the deaths of Zwingli and Ecolampadius in 1531. Today I want to describe the creation and evolution of that network that linked the reformers of South Germany and Switzerland from 1518 through 1531, based on the published correspondence of the reformers of Zurich, Basel, Strasbourg, Constance, and St. Gallen. The number of surviving letters written by or sent to the reformers in these cities varies significantly. So too does the balance between letters sent and those received by any given individual. With roughly 1,300 extant letters from this period, Zwingli's correspondence is the largest, but only about 1/4 of the letters were written by the Zurich reformer. There are about 650 surviving letters in Badian's correspondence through 1531, but the overwhelming majority of these letters were sent to the St. Gallen Burgermeister, and there are only 17 letters penned by him. Because of the high proportion of letters received by both Zwingli and Badian, their correspondence is particularly valuable for highlighting the wide range of little-known individuals who wrote to the reformers. Zwingli and Badian are also the only reformers with a significant amount of extant correspondence from the second decade of the 16th century, which is actually why I'm beginning in 1518 to even things out a little. Their letters, however, give us valuable information about their student days and early career. In contrast, the future reformers of Basel and Strasbourg moved frequently during the early 1520s, in part to avoid arrest by church officials. This is certainly the case with Ecolampadius and Butzer. This means that very little remains of their early correspondence, and a higher proportion of what survives is made up of letters written by them. Almost 80% of the approximately 500 letters in Ecolampadius' surviving correspondence were written by the Basler. The extant correspondence through 1531 of the Strasbourg reformers, Capito and Butzer, is roughly the same size as that of Ecolampadius. In both cases, about 60% of the extant letters were written by the reformer. Far less remains of the correspondence of other individuals. There are 274 letters in the published correspondence of the brothers Ambrosius and Thomas Blauer through the end of 1531, and another 128 letters written to or by Oswald Myconius for the same time period. To these I have added the surviving letters up through 1531 of Heinrich Bullinger, Konrad Pelikan, Leo Jude, Johannes Zwick, and Kaspar Hediow. Last but not least, for reasons that will become clear through the course of this paper, I have also included the extant correspondence of Beatus Renatus. I have not included Erasmus's correspondence in this study completely, but I do draw on his letters to and from individuals in the Holy Roman Empire and the Swiss Confederation between 1514 and 1525. After this date, he virtually disappears from the network. Two graphs illustrate the development of the correspondence network in which these 14 individuals participated. The network involved roughly 700 individuals, including 16 women, and about 50 collective groups. Mostly the pastors or councils of various cities. The network began small, with 83 individuals in 1518, but by 1520 it had grown to 120 people, and it stayed at about that size until close to the end of the decade, when it rose to 170 individuals or groups, over twice the original number of participants. Correspondents were located almost entirely in South Germany and Switzerland. Although there were some contacts with Wittenberg in the early part of the decade, this network had very little overlap with the correspondence network centered in Wittenberg that was shaped largely by Luther and Melanchthon. Figure 3 shows the number of letters exchanged each year, which follows the same pattern of growth. Between 1518 and 1520, the number of letters sent each year more than doubled, from 140 to 312. Then it declined to between 220 and 270 for the next 7 years, after which the number rose again to reach a peak of 445 letters in 1531. Correspondence networks are not static, but they change over time as new friends join and older friends die or disappear. In the 1520s, such unfriending was often due to disagreements about the type and pace of religious reforms. And it could be as important as friending in determining the shape of a correspondence network. We can see this process at work as we follow the development of the Reformers' correspondence networks over the next 14 years. But before looking more closely at the evolution of the network, I must first make two general observations about its composition. The first concerns the importance of generational identity. While younger men could and did correspond with older ones, most of those who wrote regularly to each other belonged to the same age cohort. This had important consequences for the religious affiliation of the correspondence. For as is well known, the response of German humanists to the teachings emanating from Wittenberg varied by generation. The first prominent German humanists, men such as Jakob Wimpfling, Johannes Reuchlin, Ulrich Sasius, Konrad Peutinger, the brothers Bernhard and Konrad Adelmann, and Willibald Pirkheimer, were all born between 1450 and 1470. Erasmus also belonged to this age group. Of these, only Pirkheimer, born in 1470, broke with the Roman Church. A somewhat younger cohort, there we go. A somewhat younger cohort, born between 1475 and 1490, was more divided religiously. This group included not only Luther and Zwingli, but also Capito, Ephraim, Vadian, Helican, Bede, and Iconius. It also included outspoken opponents of the Reformation, such as Johannes Eck, Johannes Fabri, and Johannes Cochlaeus, who all belonged to this network in its early years. Finally, a significant number of future reformers were born during the 1490s and early 1500s, from Theobald Billiken and Martin Butzer, both born in 1491, through Heinrich Bullinger, born in 1509. These would join the network in the early 1520s. The existence of these age cohorts has a direct relation to my second observation. Young men eager to gain a reputation as humanists created their circle of correspondence by writing to people they already knew, especially their fellow students and their teachers. It is important to remember here that in late medieval universities, the line between students and teachers was not as sharp as it is today, since teachers in the arts faculty were usually students matriculated in one of the higher faculties. They were often no more than a decade older than their students, and they filled the role of mentors. This allowed for closer personal relations than we normally associate between students and teachers. This means if we are to understand the three humanist correspondence networks that existed at the beginning of the Reformation, we must begin by looking at the universities where the network's members studied. The oldest and largest of the correspondence networks extended through Upper Germany and was largely composed of Germans who studied at one or more of the 5 universities of the South. At least 37 members of the correspondence network matriculated in Heidelberg and 31 in Tübingen. 6 of these men studied at both universities. Virtually all of them were German. Only 4 students at the 2 universities came from the Swiss Confederation. Freiburg and Basel formed a second axis of study. There were at least 47 men who matriculated at Freiburg and 66 who matriculated in Basel. 15 of them studied at both universities. A much larger proportion of these students were Swiss. 11 of those who studied at Freiburg and half of those in Basel came from the Confederation. The chief attraction in Freiburg was its reputation for law, and most particularly its law professor Ulrich Sasius. While some students, like Johannes Zwick, studied law in preparation for a career in the church, others, like Basilius Amerbach, intended to pursue a secular career. In comparison to these 4 universities, Ingolstadt attracted few future reformers. Only 18 students matriculated in Ingolstadt, all but one of them from within the empire, and all but 4 of these students also studied elsewhere. By means of comparison, only about half of the students matriculated in Heidelberg are known to have matriculated elsewhere. Most of the German students at these universities were ordained, and so intended for careers in the church. Their career path distinguished them from members of the second network, which consisted chiefly of Swiss who became schoolmasters. The most important university for these students was Basel, where 34 Swiss matriculated, including Oswald Miconius and his compatriot from Lucerne, Johannes Xylotectus. Both of these men worked as schoolmasters after leaving the university. Another 13 Swiss studied in Vienna, many of them drawn to study there with Joachim Vadian. Ulrich Zwingli served as parish priest through the 1510s, first in Glarus and then in Einsiedeln, but we sometimes forget that he was also teaching boys in both places, and he sent them to Vienna to study with Vadian. There was also a close connection with Paris. The noted Swiss pedagogue Heinrich Glarian ran a bursa in Basel from 1514 to 1517, and then moved to Paris, taking several young Swiss with him, before returning to Basel in 1522. 11 future correspondents from the empire also studied in Paris. Half of these were Alsatians, most of them from Selistadt, which highlights the schoolmaster's influence on his students' choice of university. The correspondence of Vadian, Zwingli, and Glarian with their students suggests that teachers also played an important role in shaping their individuals' early correspondence network. The links between Basel and Paris were fostered in a different way through the book trade. Johann Heinlein, who taught in Paris before moving to Basel in 1474, encouraged his student Johannes Amabach to set up a printing press in Basel in 1478. Other Germans and Swiss who studied in Paris, most notably Beatus Renanus, found work as correctors in either Basel or Strasbourg. What stimulated the development of a third correspondence network, though, was Erasmus' arrival in Basel in 1514. This network drew from the existing South German and Swiss networks, but it also differed from them in significant ways. Erasmus' correspondence illustrates the importance of personal connections in the development of a correspondence network. Up through the summer of 1514, Erasmus corresponded with individuals he had come to know while living in the Low Countries, France, England, and Italy. Among the roughly 300 letters that survive from this period, there are only 2 from German correspondence, Wimpfling in 1511 and Weichlin in the spring of 1514. The shape of Erasmus' correspondence changed dramatically after the Dutch humanists moved to Basel later that year. Of the roughly 150 extant letters written between August 1514 and July of 1516, which includes Erasmus' first stay at the city on the Rhine, more than half were written to or received from German speakers. His new correspondence included prominent humanists who were roughly his own age, such as Pirkheimer and Zasius, whom he met in Freiburg. It also included a number of humanists from the middle cohort. Some of these worked closely with him at Foden's print shop, including Renanus, Capito, Ecolampadius, and Pelikan. Others lived nearby, like the Strasbourg jurist Nicholas Gerbel and the Selistadt schoolmeister Johannes Zapius. In contrast, there are very few correspondents from the youngest age cohort, although Erasmus acted as patron to a few promising young scholars, such as Wilhelm Naesen and Bonifatius Amabach. Significantly, with the exception of the 3 Amabach brothers, virtually all of Erasmus's correspondents were Germans rather than Swiss. The only other Swiss with whom Erasmus corresponded were Glarian, 3 to and 3 from Erasmus, and Zwingli. This figure illustrates how these 3 correspondence networks were related. On the right side, over here, the arrow is showing up. There it is. Zwingli and Vadian up here. We can see the large number of individuals corresponding with both Zwingli and Vadian who were not more integrated into a correspondence network. Many of these were either fellow students or students of these 2 reformers. On the left-hand side are reformers. Oops, this went too far. Just go back. Is there a, here it is. This is 1519, I need to go back. Is it down here? There we go. Okay. Yeah, okay, so over here on the left-hand side, we see all of the Germans from the Middle Age cohort who corresponded with Erasmus, but who maintained contact with Germans elsewhere. So Capito, Ecolampadius. I suspect that if more of the correspondence of Capito and Ecolampadius survived from the second decade of the 16th century, we would probably see a similar group of letters with younger students, like we see with Vadian and Zwingli. Erasmus's correspondents at the top were largely humanists who were roughly the same age as Erasmus. The cohort born in the 1590s, the youngest cohort, such as Butzer and Johannes Zwick, had only a minor presence in this network. And it is worth noticing that Thomas Blarer, who is on this chart, left no surviving correspondence with anyone in the larger network in 1518, although his brother Ambrosius was incorporated into it. It turns out that Beatus Renatus is the individual who had contact with all three networks, the Swiss, the Erasmians, and through his correspondence with fellow Saalestadt native Martin Butzer, the youngest cohort of Germans. And I should point out here, this is maybe even a little misleading because, of course, Renatus, Ecolampadius, and Capito were all in Basel, so there was no need for them to write to each other. The correspondence network was also quite extensive geographically. Basel stands out because of the presence there of Capito, Renatus, and others who corresponded with Erasmus at that time in the Low Countries, and with individuals in Erfurt and Wittenberg. Zwingli and Einsiedel down in the bottom, down here, and there we go, over here, wrote to his friends in Zurich and Basel, and to Glarian in Paris, and Gaudian over in Vienna corresponded with men in Krakow and Budapest, as well as with those back home in Switzerland. I'll now show the Reformers' correspondence at 3-year intervals to highlight the evolution of this network and the response to major developments in the early Reformation. I make one exception by showing both 1524 and 1525 in order to show the changes caused by the outbreak of the Eucharistic controversy. So, as we've seen, the correspondence network in 1521 is larger and denser than in 1518. Although connections remained with Paris, Louvain, and Vienna, the bulk of correspondence is now between Basel, Zurich, and St. Gallen in the south, Erfurt and Wittenberg in central Germany, and the Palatinate and Worms at the time of the Imperial Diet. Figure 8, which shows a little bit more detail, allows us to see how dense the communication is in the southwest of the empire over here, and then up with contacts with Erfurt and Wittenberg. The correspondence networks were much better developed as well. Vadian, over in the top right from your side, received a large number of letters from men who were not otherwise part of the correspondence network. But after his return to St. Gallen in 1519, he became more firmly embedded in the Swiss correspondence network, which joined him with Zwingli, Vadian, Niconius, Marius, and Renatus. That network had already expanded to include several young humanists now settled in southern Germany, most notably Michael Hummelberg in Ravensburg, Caspar Ursinus Velius, who moved from Vienna to Basel and then Freiburg, and Johannes Alexander Brasicanus in Constance. These men, in turn, had connections with Thomas Blarer, who in 1521 was studying in Wittenberg. Butzer had begun corresponding with Zwingli, but most of his correspondents were still located along the Rhine from Alsace north to the Upper Palatinate. Capito, in the service of the Archbishop Elector, Capito's up here, Butzer down there, Ecolampadius over here. Capito, in the service of Archbishop Elector Albrecht von Brandenburg, was now the most important figure connecting the South German and Swiss circle with those in Wittenberg. In contrast, Erasmus, who was now in Louvain, was connected to the South German group chiefly through his contacts with men he had worked with in Basel. Ecolampadius had entered the monastery in Altomünster near Augsburg in 1520, and very little survives of his correspondence from 1521. The next 3 years would be decisive, especially for the young Germans who were preparing for church careers. Late medieval universities had very few permanent chairs, and after students received the desired degree, they left the university. Clergy with a bachelor's or master's degrees might hope for a parish benefice, while those with advanced degrees in theology became preachers or sought administrative positions within the church. A significant number of the older two age cohorts of Germans had studied theology in preparation for a career as a preacher or in administration. But Luther's excommunication in 1521 meant that students born in the 1590s were not far enough along to have studied much theology, and they had to choose between continuing to pursue a higher degree in theology, which meant remaining loyal to the Roman Church, or leaving with a higher degree and seeking a parish position to support themselves. Caspar Hedio was the only reformer born in the 1490s to obtain a doctorate in theology, although Butzer was close to finishing his theological degree before he left the Dominican order. A few others, such as Konrad Sam and Johannes Zwick, were able to finish degrees in law rather than theology before becoming preachers or pastors. A number of younger students left the ministry or left the university without having this kind of specialized training. And as figure 10 shows, by 1524 they had become pastors or preachers in cities across South Germany, where they helped spread evangelical teachings. Most of this movement occurred over 1522 and 1523, and by 1524 the reformers, to show a detailed view of this, the reformers were settled in the cities where they would have their future careers. Figure 11 shows the web of correspondence that joined the cities of South Germany to Basel and Strasbourg, as well as the growing links between Strasbourg, Basel, Zurich, St. Gallen, and Constance. Figure 12 shows how these connections had developed between individuals. Significantly, many of the students who dominated the early correspondence of both Vadian and Zwingli have disappeared. None of them sought careers in the church. Vadian still maintained contact chiefly with other Swiss, but Zwingli was now corresponding with Ecolampadius, Capito, and Butzer. The Strasbourg reformers, in turn, were in contact with Osiander, Regius, and Brenz in South Germany, as well as with Luther, Melanchthon, and Bugenhagen in Wittenberg. Erasmus, who had now settled in Basel, still held a prominent position due to his direct connections with Capito and his correspondence with other humanists, who in turn corresponded with the reformers of Strasbourg and Basel. At first glance, Figure 13 does not show any obvious change to the geographical range of the correspondence networks after the outbreak of the Eucharistic controversy. This was at least in part because reformers in both Strasbourg and Basel wrote to the Wittenbergers in 1525 in order to win them to their new understanding of the Eucharist, or at least to persuade them not to write against them. And this, I think, shows why it is important to look at the contents of the letters rather than simply at the authors and the people, the recipients. The web connecting Strasbourg with Basel and Zurich with places elsewhere in the Swiss Confederation, had become denser by this time, as illustrated by the size of the 3 nodes. As Figure 15 shows, the reformers in each of these 3 cities had connections with distinct circles. The Strasburgers and Ecolampadius with Germans, Ecolampadius, Zwingli, over here, Vadian, Erasmus, Capito, and Butzer, and the joint letters by the Strasbourg pastors. The impact of the Eucharistic controversy was much clearer by 1528. For all intents and purposes, the correspondence network was now restricted to South Germany and Switzerland. Zurich had become the center of a web that extended through the northern part of the Swiss Confederation and reached to Bern in the west and Chur in the east. There was contact between Basel and Bern as well, but the city on the Rhine also looked north to Strasbourg and northeast to Ulm. Constance was notable for maintaining contact with both the South Germans, South German cities and the Swiss cities of Zurich and St. Gallen. Vadian had met the Strasbourg reformers at the Bern Disputation in January 1528, which led to an exchange of letters over the course of that year, not only with the two reformers, but also with Jakob Bedwot, a teacher in Strasbourg who had studied with Vadian in Vienna. These connections all show up in figure 18. Vadian, Butzer, Capito, Zwingli, Ecolampadius. What's not so obvious is that the many correspondents of Zwingli and Vadian who were not otherwise connected to this network were Swiss. While the otherwise unconnected correspondents of the Strasburgers and Ecolampadius were mostly Germans. There would be another major change to the correspondence network at the end of the 1520s, caused by renewed efforts to establish an alliance that was both theological and political. Landgraf Philip of Hesse played a leading role through the correspondence with Strasbourg and Zurich. The map does not show the equally important correspondence between the Landgraf and the Saxon reformers. As in 1528, the Zurich reformers corresponded overwhelmingly with other Swiss. The Strasburgers also corresponded with Swiss, but they had a much higher proportion of German correspondence as well. A comparison of the number of letters to Strasbourg with those written to Zurich reflects the significant imbalance in extant correspondence. There are many letters to Zwingli from pastors scattered throughout the Swiss Confederation that are preserved in the Zurich archives. There is no equivalent in Strasbourg. The Strasburgers received a smaller number of letters from more distant places, but as the somewhat larger size of the nodes shows, some of these involved more regular exchanges of letters. In other words, more frequent correspondence. A lot of the letters sent to Zwingli are from individuals for whom there is only one letter. More revealing of the underlying changes is figure 22, which shows that the correspondence network was now being pulled between the two poles of Zwingli and Butzer. Zwingli's circle of correspondence was not significantly different from what it was in 1528, consisting chiefly of Swiss. At the other end of the spectrum, Capito had been eclipsed as correspondence by his younger colleague Butzer. Butzer and Capito were both still important figures within the existing network of South German and Swiss reformers, but Butzer also had a large circle of correspondence throughout Germany. Through his old friendship with Renatus, he was also indirectly connected with the older humanist network, which was otherwise, by this time, completely divorced from that of the reformers. Both Vadian and Ecolampadius also had a small number of correspondents outside of the network, most of whom were Swiss. Reflecting his work as reformer in Esslingen and Memmingen, Blauer's correspondence outside the network were largely German. This has been a very swift overview, but I think it demonstrates the value of examining the network that linked individual reformers together. Perhaps the most striking feature to emerge from all of these graphs is the differentiation between the Swiss and German correspondence. Through Strasbourg and Basel, the Swiss had ties with Wittenberg in the early years of the Reformation, but those links broke in 1525 after the outbreak of the Eucharistic controversy, leading the Swiss and the South Germans to strengthen their contacts with each other. The new centers were Zurich, Basel, and Strasbourg, and especially the correspondence between Zwingli, Ecolampadius, and Capito. Significantly, all three men were roughly the same age, and the latter two had worked closely with Erasmus. But the distinction between the Swiss and the South Germans was only temporarily muted, and it re-emerged at the end of the 1520s. Butzer's growing prominence accentuated this distinction, for his correspondence circle was always the most German of any of these reformers. And it's worth pointing out that Butzer was educated in Heidelberg, had the least connections with Swiss of any of the major reformers before the 1520s. Butzer had little contact until after he settled in Strasbourg, but his contacts reached into central Germany and even to Wittenberg at both the beginning and the end of the 1520s. In contrast, Zwingli's correspondence circle was always the most clearly Swiss. Basel would be an important link between the Swiss and South German networks throughout this period. Constance, too, proved to be an important intermediary between the Empire and the Confederation. The city's strong traditional ties with Zurich and St. Gallen were balanced by Laur's influence as reformer in the imperial cities of Swabia. The deaths of Zwingli and Ecolampadius toward the end of 1531 would lead to a major reconfiguration of this correspondence network. As their successors in Zurich and Basel respectively, Bullinger and Niconius would become major participants in the correspondence network. But that is a paper that I look forward to hearing later at the conference.